I might as well get started. Hello and welcome everybody to the last of the four and the fourth CG seminar for the Research on Research stream. I'm very privileged here to introduce this seminar's topic on open science and our two esteemed guests, Professor Vincent Larivière, who is the UNESCO Chair for Open Science at the University of Montreal, and the esteemed Tony Rosselier, who is the head of the Open and Reproducible Research Group at the TU Graz in Austria. I hope I pronounced that right, Tony. Just to go through let's just go through the housekeeping for today's event. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on the CG website after the event. Also, just to make sure that everybody knows the house rules and housekeeping rules, please keep yourself muted unless you're asked to speak. You can turn on your video if you prefer to do it. Also, please remember that there are different views on Zoom, so you can select the speaker view or the larger room if you want. And please also note that you can ask questions during or after the two presentations today, and we will refer to them at the question time at the conclusion of the second presentation. Please also note that when I ask for you, you are free to turn on your video and ask your question directly to our two guests today as well. So without further ado, and as soon as I stop here, I am going to invite Professor Vincent Larivière to start his presentation. Vincent, over to you, please.
Thank you, Gemma. Thanks to everyone for coming. Let me just do that. And thanks for the invitation. Okay. Okay, so my talk is going to basically be in three parts. I will start by just discuss a bit the changing role of scholarly publishing, because we need to understand that in order to make proper actions, in order to make science more open and to make this openness sustainable over the next couple of decades. Then I want to present some data, actually, some of it actually very recent, most of it unpublished actually, on open access and on basically the control of scholarly papers at the world level. And then I'm going to conclude with a few key issues for actions, and hopefully that's going to lead to an interesting discussion afterwards. So as you all are aware, scholarly publishing is increasingly important in researchers' career. And so there's been a shift in the last basically 2 decades where researchers not only publish to disseminate science, but also to show that they are being active, that they are actually doing research. For a researcher to stop publishing for a couple of years, because they are even a couple of months in some fields, but for a researcher to stop publishing for a little while, is kind of a signal that they are not doing anything, which in a way is totally wrong, because while you're not publishing, you are actually doing the research. So publishing is no longer a signal of research output, but it's a signal of research activity in some way. And it's very interesting to contrast that with the late Peter Higgs, who died a couple of years ago, who published his last paper in 1979. Peter Higgs, I think, published something like 20 papers over the course of his entire career. And he considered, starting in 1979, that he kind of completed his research dissemination journey, that he did not have anything to disseminate anymore. He was still reading, still being active on committees, but not doing any research publication, which again reminds us that we do not win the Nobel Prize or cure cancer based on an absolute number of papers, but we only need one big paper or one big discovery, in a way, to change the face of the world. And of course, the context for that is the growth in research evaluation and basically bibliometrics, for which there's huge national differences in the implementation. And by that, I mean that some countries have strong national research assessment systems that have a huge bibliometric component, and some countries like mine have basically none. But in some places where it's really important, well, it is influencing the entire research activity of researchers. But even in places like Canada, where there's no research assessment exercise, universities still take into account or give value, I would say, to university rankings, which are mostly based on bibliometric data, and therefore kind of influence in a sometimes not in a strong way, but in subtle ways, the behaviors of researchers. So that's kind of the context. We are publishing more and more. And that is shown in, of course, macro level bibliometric data. And so this is based from the Dimensions database. OpenAlex gives slightly different results because of the, I would say, the diversity of scholarly documents that it indexes. But basically, we're publishing at the world level more than 7 million papers a year in the last couple of years, which is a lot. And people may argue that we're not necessarily discovering as much as what the number of papers would suggest. But then who controls those papers? So I want to go back basically almost 30 years now, when basically the internet became something, and where journals were still in print, and researchers were trying to figure out how the scholarly communication landscape would evolve. So in 1995, the economic magazine Forbes wrote it's actually a very long paper on scholarly publishing, and basically arguing that Elsevier would be the first victim of the internet. Basically stating that the web was created to bring academics together. Now it offered them a way to disseminate their research for free. Why would we need journals anymore? So basically two contrasting groups existed back then. One of which was arguing that basically the scholarly publishing world would not need publishers and journals anymore, because everything would be disseminated online through systems that they believe would probably be analogous to archive today. But there was also another group that was actually, one could say, a bit pessimistic, arguing that there's a need for collective infrastructure, there's a need for infrastructure period to disseminate things online, and that these infrastructure were probably more likely to be made by corporation, and that in turn it would be a scholarly publishing world that would be mostly controlled by for-profit publishers like Elsevier. And so a couple of years ago, I wrote a paper that basically showed that indeed corporate publishers controlled a larger and larger share of the world's scholarly papers. And that was, of course, based on the Web of Science, because that was the only database that existed back then with Scopus. But again, Scopus would have given similar numbers. And so those results can be seen there in the blue lines. So what this shows basically is that if you take a database or a data source that only restricts to the most cited journals, then of course you do see an increase in the Web of in top corporate publishers controlling most of the research output. But then when you actually take an inclusive data set, which in a way should cover everything that is published at the world level, you actually see a deconcentration in who controls scholarly paper. And that basically starts in the late 1990s, exactly at the point where it was in a way easier to create electronic journals. So systems like open journal systems now allow basically any researcher or institution to create their own journal and managing it in a relatively easy manner. And so since then, we're actually seeing that if we take every journal and every publisher into account, we do see not an increase in concentration, but actually a decrease in concentration. What is quite striking, and that kind of explains the Web of Science figure here, is that we, however, give more and more importance to these probably so-called international journals in our evaluation systems, which mean that they attract probably the most some of the most important players. So the who controls research papers, that question is actually a bit more complex than it seems. How much open access is there when we take more inclusive data? So I started playing with OpenAlex. Perhaps some of you have also used it. OpenAlex basically indexes pretty much every paper that is published at the world level. There's a few blind spots, among others in Asia, but it indexes around 250 million papers at the world level. And so if you take all of open Alex, slightly more than 20% is in open access. If we only take articles that are published in journals, and so that's the last row there, we're at about 30%. Of course, there's huge differences over time. So for older years, so 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, still a very small minority of papers are in open access. And of course, we're talking about openness at this current point in time. But if you look at more recent papers, well, we do reach a majority of outputs that are in open access, and that basically starts in 2020. And so for papers published in 2023, we're at almost 2/3 of papers that are in open access, which means that, again, for our contemporary publishing behavior, open access is actually the norm rather than the exception. Of course, that's related to preprint policies, among other things. So most journals allow researchers to put in parallel with their published version, which may be in a closed journal, that could be published in open access. So about 85% of journals allow it. In that slide, the American Chemical Society is a bit of an in-between, where it has different policies depending on if you are subject to an open access mandate. They also wanted recently to charge authors for submitting preprint, but globally we're at about 80% of papers. One of the arguments that have been proposed to kind of convince researchers that open access was the right thing to do is the global impact that it can have. So basically, given the cost of subscriptions, for many countries in the world, the only science that they have access to is the one that's published in open access. And so almost, well, 15 years ago, there was a paper that showed that indeed developing countries and many countries in Asia actually cited more open access than closed document, and then that North America and Europe were mostly citing closed documents. So that's from 15 years ago. We updated that data recently, and it's kind of no longer the case, because Western papers are also increasingly in open access. And then given the effects of national self-citations, actually Europe and North America are citing more open access papers than closed paper, but also so does Africa. There's a few parts of the world that actually more than expected rely on closed paper. That's the case for China, India, as well as a few countries in the north of Africa. But the global impact argument related to open access is, one could say, less and less true in the entire ecosystem. We still observe a open access citation advantage in the sense that, and I'm putting quotation mark here because it's it kind of depends on the type of open access that you're looking at, but definitely self-archived papers, so that's green open access, have higher than a higher impact than expected. Now moving to specific issues. So of course, you guys all remember the COVID-19 pandemic, and this actually has led to a huge awareness on the importance of having open science practices. There was slightly more open data, but there was definitely a higher open access rate for COVID-related papers. What is quite striking, though, is that for climate change, which can be considered as an even bigger threat to humanity, we don't have the same level of collective engagement. So at the world level, we're at like 1 paper out of 2 that is available in open access, and that's only for recent years. But perhaps more importantly, the way for-profit publishers reacted to the pandemic versus how they are reacting to climate change is totally different. So this slide shows the proportion of open access papers for again, let's say the top three publishers. They have indeed opened everything that was related with COVID-19. Of course, in many of those cases, these were temporarily open papers. So just for the time of the pandemic, many of them are probably closed now. But then when you compare that with how they are doing for climate change, and basically everything related to SDGs, sorry, we're at a much lower proportion of openness. And if you take Elsevier, that's for recent years, 3 papers out of 10, so 30% of papers that are being closed. So we're not reacting in the same manner, and I think that's probably an interesting call for action in that respect. I'll say a few words on predatory publishers as kind of an adverse effect in that space. It's an adverse effect of having APCs as an acceptable practice. We could collectively say that APCs are not should not exist, and that would easily get rid of for-profit publishers. Of course, that's also due to pressures to publish, to the fact that we basically mostly disseminate our findings in a single language, which means that everyone can basically that any predatory journal can exist in only one language. There doesn't need to be a diversity of those, and of course, it's not limited to conferences to journals. You've got conferences that are predatory, networking, softwares, as well as indicators. There's plenty of versions of the impact factors that exist that they showcase on their website. So in order to document that, we focused on one of those predatory publishers, which is called Omics. And it's possible to talk about Omics as a predatory publisher because it was legally labeled as such by the US federal government. So basically in 2018, it lost a lawsuit for $50 million for basically deceptive practices. So it argues on its website that it does peer review. It does not. And it also argues that its journals and papers are indexed in databases, which they are not. So we documented how Omics reacted to these lawsuits. And so they actually did 2 things. The first thing, they rebranded all of their journals, but they did that in a historical manner. So prior to losing the lawsuit, they started to purchase a few small publishers, some of them predatory, some of them being just small, unknown publishers. And they basically rebranded everything historically to make the mentions of Omics disappear. Because, of course, a publisher with no reputation, a publisher that you never heard of, is better than a publisher that has a bad reputation. So as an example of such rebranding, I'm showing you a journal which is called Advances in Pharmacoepidemiology and Drug Safety. Published its first issue in 2012 under Omics. That's how the website looked like. So we use the Internet Wayback Machine to kind of document this rebranding. So a beautiful logo of yeah, I won't comment on the quality of the logo. I think you can make your idea for yourself, but that's clearly an Omics journal. Then in 2015, they made the Omics logo disappear and replaced it with, let's say, kind of a generic logo with pills. And then in 2019, basically adding the Longdom logo, and again doing that in a historical manner on each and every paper. So basically Omics disappeared from the website, while at the same time they remain the owner of the journal. The other interesting element about that journal is that the editor-in-chief, the current editor-in-chief, died in 2016, which means that he's not so, he's very generous on acceptance. And when you look at their papers, right now, well, you kind of have, again, this entire array of other publishers that appear as the main publishers behind the journal. The second way they reacted was by hijacking, basically copying content that came from a legitimate journal. So here I'm going to document a case of the Journal of Bone Research and Report, which basically copies the content of an Elsevier journal that's called Bone Reports. And when you look at the copy, sometimes they're an identical copy, sometimes it's translated and retranslated. I think nowadays they could probably use AI to generate papers, or it's sometimes totally unrelated content. So the goal there is just to fill the journal with what could look like legitimate content. So on the left there, you've got the copy, and on the right, you have the original paper. You see that it's kind of a very rough copy paste where the A here that leads to the affiliation is just copied as part of the surname string. So it's not so subtle in terms of the type of copy paste. But what's striking is how they changed some of the words, again, using an algorithm. And that basically leads to what Guillaume Cabanac would call tortured phrases. So the expression based on N here on top is replaced by supported associate in nursing. Associate in nursing is a degree in the US that has AN as its acronym. And then plus, this is my favorite, plus minus standard deviation that is replaced by mean plus minus Mount Rushmore state, which is South Dakota. That is why SD is replaced by that. So again, it kind of shows how they're trying to, again, make sure that we submit papers to their journal. So I don't have much time left, so just a few call for action points. What do we need to do to make science more open and to make it sustainably open without having to manage all of the adverse effects on research evaluation? So first, we need to support collective infrastructure. If we want researchers to disseminate or to create their own journals or to actually contribute to scholarly publishing, we need to have collective infrastructure that are as good as those of as for-profit publisher. That needs government financial investment, and many countries are actually doing it. Canada is doing it, Europe is doing it, but there needs to be an infrastructure for those who want to invest in them. But we also need to engage as researchers, and we need to submit our best pieces to journals and publishers that have practices that we consider to be appropriate. Of course, we need to reform research assessment. And this is an obvious thing that everyone says, but it feels that everyone is saying that it's someone else's responsibility, which I must say gets on my nerve. This is not the government responsibility. This is our responsibility, because who sits on those panels? Who informs the government? It is researchers. So it's not only a policymaker issue. It's an issue that the community controls and that it needs to argue for. And in that context, we need to think about what is the role of indicators there, and do we actually need indicators anymore? And if so, which ones? And I would argue that we need to focus on indicators that support science for common good rather than a, let's say, neoliberal-ish type of indicators. And of course, these policies need to be coherent by acknowledging the disciplinary diversity and national differences, and making sure that we don't apply, for instance, criteria of medical sciences to the social sciences and humanities. So thank you so much, and hopefully we can have a fun discussion.
Thank you, Vincent, and you'll probably be happy to know that you've already influenced 2 questions already in our chat. Jorge, who put the questions up, I hope you won't mind if we move on to the second presentation and leave this question as the first question after the conclusion of Tony's presentation. And without further ado, can I introduce Tony Roselia, who from TU Graz, who will be talking next. Tony, over to you.
You can see my screen, I hope. Awesome, thank you. Let me just get ready here. Okay. So today, thinking about the topic of open science, there's lots and lots of things to say, but I thought I would focus on some current work that we have ongoing, which is really looking at the impact of open science. What we found, especially in kind of our reviews of the evidence that exists, and the challenges and prospects ahead. So to start, what is open science? So lots of definitions around, they usually revolve around transparency, accessibility, inclusivity, collaboration. In 2021, UNESCO made a concerted effort to kind of give a global view to open science and kind of develop this recommendation document, which included a definition which aimed to be kind of maximally inclusive about what open science means and link it to what it means to the the Declaration on Human Rights, for example. And so in the UNESCO view, the aims of open science are to make scientific knowledge openly accessible, available, and reusable for everyone. And that means knowledge in multiple languages. So we know that kind of the language of science is drifting ever more to English, but multilingual scientific knowledge, openly available, accessible, reusable. To increase scientific collaborations, as well as the sharing of information for the benefits of both the academic system, but also its interactions and influence and impact on society, and to open the processes of scientific knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication to societal actors beyond the traditional scientific community. So get away from the ivory tower that kind of scientists would seem to have traditionally sat in and kind of then look to disseminate the findings to others, but to include non-academic audiences already in the processes of knowledge creation. And so this boils down then to a diverse bunch of practices which are kind of underpinned or aiming towards distinct values and principles. So under the types of practices, these are all aiming to, in their various ways, to bring transparency, accessibility, accountability, and collaboration to scientific processes. So if we think of opening up the knowledge itself, then this can mean opening the scientific publications, so removing paywalls, which block many academics and especially audiences outside the academy from being able to read scientific literature, or scholarly literature, maybe we should better say. Opening up research data, or at least making it fair, findable, accountable, interoperable, reusable. Opening educational resources, source software and code. Opening up hardware even. But then this is all underpinned by making the infrastructures that we use to do open science themselves open, with communal governance often. And then the open engagement of societal actors, including through, for example, public engagement, but also citizen science, which directly involves the public in processes of data analysis or data collection and then also to ensure open dialogue with other knowledge systems. So this was really a new focus within the UNESCO recommendation on epistemic justice, on not only within kind of the traditional subjects of kind of Western universities, but also to make sure that our or these knowledge systems are in dialogue with others. So, and these are all really quite diverse things. If you, the problem of opening scholarly publications is really quite different from making educational resources open or source code open. And these are all underpinned by quite different values. So for UNESCO, the values are quality and integrity, and it's seen that bringing transparency and greater and earlier sharing of research outputs and plans will improve quality and integrity of research. And this speaks to, for instance, concerns about what was called the reproducibility crisis in some disciplines, and now is more optimistically framed, I think, not as a crisis, but as an opportunity to reform research in directions which better underpin quality and integrity, but also to ensure collective benefit, equity and fairness, diversity and inclusiveness. But the principles are also more transparency, scrutiny, critique, equality of opportunities, responsibility, respect and accountability, collaboration, flexibility, sustainability. And all these are all obviously great things, who What's missing here, and is very often present, at least 10 years ago in kind of policy documents, is wanting more efficiency, better bang for your buck. And for instance, I think one of the selling points of policymakers to politicians was that opening scientific knowledge resources would enable kind of value creation beyond the academy, and so on. So the question that I want to ask is, are our plans working? So we have these values and principles which both underpin and motivate wanting to transition towards open science, but they're also kind of the goals. We want more quality, we want higher quality, we want better levels of integrity. We want to increase equality of opportunity, equity, inclusivity, and so on. In what ways are we looking to this bigger picture to ensure that we are on track towards those greater things? And so what are the longer term consequences of not only us making things open, is making things open achieving those things in the way that we thought they were, and why we set out on this journey, but also the ways that we're going about it. If you think of all the values and principles that open science is to aim at, I really see it more as a bunch, in the sense of a bunch of flowers. Like, they're all good things, but they are quite distinct aims in certain cases. You might have more quality, integrity. This necessarily doesn't align always with higher levels of equity, or especially in the case of efficiency, if we're driven by an agenda to make processes as efficient as possible, then these aims may sometimes be in conflict, and we face choices about how we implement open science, and in doing so, shape the kind of the open science world in which future generations will live. Are the ways that we're going about it the best ways? And I'll just take a short diversion about unintended consequences, or what Gemma, our host today, labels grimpact. So first question is, how are we monitoring open science? Is open science achieving its aims, and how is this routinely measured? I just wanted very briefly to give an example of the French Open Science Monitor. So I think I'm sharing my Chrome, so you should be able to see this, I hope. Someone shout if you can't see. This is the French Open Science Monitor, and it's a great initiative using open data to produce open metrics on progress towards open science. But if we look down the things that they are measuring, here it's the rate of open access publications, and you see it starts off lower and it gets higher. This is good, we're making progress. The rate of open doctoral theses year on year. It kind of started low, kind of level, is rising, but more slowly, rising, in recent years, maybe even dropping. On research data, proportion of publications in France that mention sharing their data by publication year. And here we see, okay, good. More publications year on year tend to be sharing their data. We're making progress. On code, the same. On clinical trials, and whether there's a lot of selective reporting in clinical trials, whether these are actually leading to publications, and observational studies and so on. So here, the point that I would make is that what we looked at there was all about the uptake of open science. Are people doing open science in terms of making their publications open access, making their data open, and so on? Okay, and it's important to monitor this. Are we making progress? But uptake is kind of the the means. We're kind of getting people to do open science. But on what's not on that page from the Open Science Monitor is anything about having made things open. Is this openness having the consequences that we wanted? Are we achieving higher levels of integrity or quality or equity, inclusivity, even efficiency? And in fact, this kind of monitoring work has often been left to researchers themselves. Okay, so just very quickly, one example of this. So within open access, there's the article processing charge model, which is your publication is immediately made openly accessible by the publisher in return for you as an author paying a fee upfront for the costs. And usually it's not you directly paying, usually it's an institution or a funder. But the point is there is a charge, it comes up front and it's author facing, or so the author, all their sources of funding, whether institution or funder. Okay. Open science, given what we said above about this bunch of principles and practices, isn't really a unified ideology, but it's a very diverse bunch of principles and practices. And it has been kind of a contested space about kind of what matters most, what do we focus on first, and which of these aims, which of these values, principles are really driving us in order to achieve this at any one time. Because if the underlying values, if more focus is given to one value than another, then decisions may be different than if another value had been given the key focus. Collective benefit, equity, inclusivity are often stated as core aims. In the UNESCO recommendation, this is obviously very clear. And the UNESCO recommendation in centering this is a huge step forward because it was very often implicit but not central to a lot of other definitions. But just because things are made open, will that necessarily ensure collective benefit, equity, inclusivity? So within research, we know that it's an unequal landscape. Kind of historical factors, hegemonies of power, concentration of resources, and so on, continue to shape our world. And so factors like region, gender, discipline, access to resources will continue to shape possibilities of participation in an open science world. Open science, it is somewhat resource intensive. In order to make data open, there is a lot of know-how, awareness, technical knowledge, and just time that it takes to do things properly. And there are various routes to the implementation of open science. The how is crucially important. So within this a previous project of ours, we asked the question, could open science actually be at risk in some cases of reinforcing existing privileges? And we had this review paper where we looked at the literature and identified actually, yes, in multiple ways, in the costs of participation, in the cumulative nature of data inequalities, the kind of the skills and know-how to be able to exploit open science data, open data, the infrastructures needed and where those that know-how and infrastructures are usually concentrated in the richer institutions. The fact that there's a lack of reward structures at present, which Vincent already touched on. The fact that there are logics of exclusion, even in something like citizen science. The people who we would think would benefit most would be those who haven't engaged with science so much beyond school. But in fact, very often the people taking part most in citizen science already have university education and so on. There's the logic of platformization, which basically means that once platforms are established, just due to their scale, they have a certain degree of lock-in of their users, and are able to use the fact that they have so much data at their disposal in order to persist through time. And then there's the model of APCs. So I think I'm running out of time. I need to speed up. The APC model takes away the barrier to readership and puts it in front of the author. So it has taken down one barrier but erected another just at the other end of the publication pipeline. And so this is a recent paper. There's been other papers on this subject. We're not the first, but this is a recent paper which shows that researchers from better resourced institutions publish more APC-based OA, pay higher APCs. And so OA publishing is creating a new barrier for who publishes where. This further excludes communities that are less centrally embedded in global science networks, and removes more global perspectives from the scientific conversation. So these are negative impacts to equity, which wouldn't have, I think they were foreseen, actually. Stephen Harnad, one of the first open access advocates, always used to rail against fool's gold. Yeah, we've ended up in this situation, which isn't where we would have wanted to be in making in the transition to open access. So then, thinking more broadly of these there are these unintended consequences, but even just the consequences that we want, are we reaching them? What actually are the impacts of open science, and how are we monitoring them for the longer term? So speeding up, we performed a literature review. We have an ongoing project on this topic of open science impact. We reviewed the literature to look at what robust evidence actually exists regarding academic, societal, and economic impacts. We used the PRISMA methodology. This is a methodology developed in clinical medicine originally for systematically reviewing the literature. And so the main findings on academic impact, you can see here we have 311 included studies. The main finding, the largest cluster by far was on the open access citation advantage. Large literature, very often only partly convincing evidence. There's a lack of robustness often in these studies, but they do seem to generally show that there is a citation advantage for open access. Evidence for the open access APC model, fostering inequalities, that open and fair data are associated with data reuse and a citation advantage for their associated papers, positive effects of open data on computational reproducibility, efficiency gains in software development through open source, evidence that citizen science is increasing the efficiency and scope of data collection, and open peer review shows neutral to positive effects on review quality. Here, the main challenge seems to be that there's often insufficient evidence to strictly establish causal claims. It's very often observational studies with, let's say, some design issues. On societal impact, the bulk of the evidence that we found pertained to citizen science. And some people might not consider citizen science a part of open science. I do, but others might vary. We do find evidence of impact in terms of education and awareness, especially on climate and environment and engagement, these mainly pertaining to citizen science. And a lot of citizen science projects are in climate and environment. Think of biodiversity monitoring and things. The challenges and evidence gaps, limited evidence of causation. We didn't find anything about the impact from open and fair data, which really surprised us. a lot of the societal impact of open access was, or what was termed to be the societal impact of open access, was based on altmetrics, and here kind of who is actually using or behind, or how people are using open access resources is sometimes difficult to gauge from altmetrics data. And just that it's difficult to measure and study societal impacts in the medium and long term. And if you think about it, there's just so many moving parts. What contribution does open access have towards improved climate and environment, for example? Very difficult to quantify these things. And on economic impact, we found 70 studies. We found some evidence of cost savings through faster access to knowledge and avoiding duplication of efforts, direct economic impacts, but little empirical evidence of positive benefits of open access and open and fair data on industry. What was there largely came from medical and biotechnology sectors. And a lot of it stems from case studies with a lack of models for broader economic assessments. And so here, challenges, gaps, great difficulty in identifying business or macroeconomic impacts, lack of sufficient evidence to actually make case studies comparable, and lack of transparency in the way that these things are reported, lack of standardized metrics to measure results on a project-by-project basis, company-by-company basis, and yeah, reluctance of companies to engage in publishing this information, and so on. So overall, in this impact study, the main challenges we found was a real lack of robust evidence, except in really key areas. And so we suggest that until now, at least, we've been far too focused on monitoring the uptake of open science, not whether it's actually achieving what we hope that it is achieving. On causality, the difficulty of directly measuring relationships between interventions, outcomes, impacts, lack of standards for defining and measuring open science impact. A lot of the evidence stems from single case studies, which, as I said before, sometimes difficult to strictly compare. And one point here is to what extent there may be publication bias, meaning selective reporting. A lot of what is reported tends to be positive. If I just did and we're not accusing anybody here, but there probably is a file draw problem here. If something just didn't work or went badly wrong, we're incentivized less to publish this. There's the streetlight effect, measuring what's easy to measure. My son's just come home, sorry. So we have, the infrastructures aren't really in place to easily measure a lot of these things. And so what we find that is easy to measure tends to appear in the literature. So for instance, the open access citation advantage, which I can see why it's important to ascertain that in order to get people to motivate them to do open access in the short term. But once everything is once everything is open in access, then this won't become a factor. And that we need qualitative and mixed methods approaches to study these things. And this often is resource intensive. A quick plug for one of the other outputs from this project of the indicator handbook, which will not only have indicators for the uptake of open science, but also for reproducibility, as well as academic, societal, and economic impacts, where it's been released in an iterative fashion. So only the first couple of chapters are there at the moment, but there is a really great opening chapter published by Vincent Trach and Thomas Klebel from my team, which reflects on issues of determining causation in science of science studies. With that, if you want to find more information or contact me, With that, I'll stop. And how far over time was I? I forgot to set my timer, Gemma.
Politely so. There you go. How's that?
Okay.
But thank you so much, Tony. I might just open the floor up to questions. We have two. One from Jorge Delgado. Jorge, do you want to make yourself visible and ask your question directly of our speakers?
Thank you very much, and good morning here from the US. So this is a topic that is really, really in my heart. So it was a comment, but also a question. So even having open access options for some researchers, sometimes the costs for researchers to get their work published is very, very high, and definitely Professor Ross. However, we saw the range of cost of how much a researcher can pay. But my question at the end is, so even if we had like a diamond open access journal, what would be the best, or what would you consider the best or the most appropriate, or I don't know, I guess it's difficult. That's why I put it in quotation marks, the good business model for journals to succeed and survive trying to use open access?
I can start with that one very quickly. So in an ideal world, or at least the ideal world that I would see, researchers would not have to care about open access at all. In that world, they would just be submitting to the journals that they want, and journal publishing would be part of it. It would be considered as something that government would fund. So basically, scholarly publishing would be part of the entire research ecosystem that would be publicly supported. And there are some initiatives like that in a few countries. So in Canada, both the provincial and the federal government are funding both a national platform as well as journals. And those are all in Diamond Open Access. But then, of course, it costs money. So it means that it needs to be factored in the budgets of funders. But I would argue that the collective cost would be lower than what individual universities pay for library subscriptions. So I would say that the money is in the system. It needs to be organized. So researcher, again, to conclude on that, researchers should not be thinking about scholarly publishing. We should be thinking about it, and then they should just do their work without having to worry about that.
If I may continue, I completely agree with that. The point is, the money is in the system. There's more that it's just how to reroute it in ways so that we have open access at both sides, where there's no charges for publication and there's no charges for readership. But we're dealing with legacy systems. There are path dependencies, which are really difficult to overcome. And at the moment, a lot of the proposals for Diamond Open Access, it mean a lot of burden for academics in running infrastructures, in running and doing that as just one of part of the 100 other hidden labors that we have that we're not directly incentivized for. Gemma and I are currently trying to set up a journal, and it will be with APCs. We would love it for it to be Diamond from the start, but unless you are fortunate enough to get a large grant, I think, or you have enough time to dedicate to setting up your own open journal systems instance and to handle all of that stuff yourself, it just doesn't seem feasible to us at all at the moment. So I think that the Diamond OA system that Vincent talked about, and essentially where it is funded from the sources which the money kind of is coming from already, you know, especially in Austria with public university systems, it is the government funding it in some way. It's just it flows through a very convoluted pipeline and into publishers' pockets. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, both of you. I'm going to hand over to David now, David Mills, to ask his questions that he put into the chat. David?
I don't know if I'm allowed to ask a different question now, having heard that conversation. I mean, the question still stands, I guess, Vincent, about the oligopoly, because clearly what you're showing is that it's about control of status, it seems to me, rather than the market.
You're totally right. I mean, of course, I knew that there was an outside of the web of science, and we kind of argue it in the paper, but I would not have expected that the trend goes totally opposite in those open database, which kind of shows that, well, that the web of science is problematic when we're thinking that we're measuring global science. But yes, it also means that systems like OJS are working. We know that they're working, but we kind of see that they're used, and there's a grassroots movement. The issue now is, how can we give symbolic capital to those venues? And I would argue that it's on our shoulders. We need to send our best papers there, because there's no such thing as a good or a bad journal. And I'm sorry for all journal editors here, I'm one of them, but there's not good or bad journals. There's good and bad papers that are being selected, or that are being submitted to the best journal because of the symbolic capital system that exists. So yeah, you're right. It's the oligopoly of the of the elite, one could say, or the oligopoly of symbolic capital.
I don't know if I'm allowed.
Do you want to... Sorry, David. Sorry, you go.
Sorry, just I mean, yeah, if I could quickly follow up just in relationship to Tony's. Tony, you said these are legacy publishers, and it's hard to get over those legacies. It seems to me one of the challenges here is that the so-called legacy publishers are putting an enormous amount of money into developing their platforms and harvesting data in ever more effective and easy to use ways, such that trying to compete with that is part of the problem, isn't it? Which is actually the sort of speed of technological evolution here. It's sort of, it feels like a technology arms race to a certain extent, but anyway, that's just a...
Absolutely. Yeah, and that goes to kind of the platform logic. I think the key there is ownership of the intellectual property. Like the reason that we didn't have the immediate transition away from Elsevier was because people like journals like The Lancet. They like journals like Cell, and they really want to publish in them, you know? So I came to research open science through open science advocacy and working in open science infrastructure. And I used to love nothing better than getting on Twitter on a Tuesday night and calling Elsevier all the names under the sun. But the more that we've moved on, there is a place, like, so just in terms of those scales that they have, maybe even if they take 40% profits, which I know is scandalous, and that the fact that they're able to keep this grip through good years and wars and COVID, and no matter what, they strip 40%. I know, okay. But what if it is because there are economies of scale? And if as an academic, I'm running my own OJS system and running around and like trying to debug at the same time as like handle 15 manuscripts, you know? What if it is more efficient for them to do some of that in terms of just the level of resourcing in the system? But it's the control of the outlets, these signifiers of credibility and quality, which the journals are still seen as being. And for all the talk about reform of research assessment, I don't think that's going away. You know, it's culture. People want to publish in these places. They value these places. So yeah, I agree with you though that the kind of position of power that they've been able to delay open science for as long as possible. They've called it all the bad names of the sun. They have claimed to embrace it and to have been for it from the start. As they kind of continue to strip profits from the subscriptions in order to reinvest them into becoming basically data selling, very often surveillance data back to us. But yeah, I don't think they're going away. I don't think they're going away. There are a lot of people in the Diamond OA Acts. Diamond OA for a lot of people doesn't seem to just mean no fees to the author and the reader. It also seems to mean non-profit. And those are two very separate issues, I think, and confounding them, I think, is it's not helpful for achieving transition. But also, I just don't see it as realistic. Nothing about the history of the open access movement in the last 20 years gives me any confidence that the publishers won't win in the end, you know? Sorry to be pessimistic.
I do notice that we have reached time, but because we have several questions in the chat, can I randomly choose one for us to quickly do in the next 3 minutes? Is that possible, guys? Okay, random. And Catherine Montgomery. She asks, would you like to ask your question, Catherine?
Oh, yes, I can do. Thank you very much, Gemma, and thank you for the presentations. You briefly mentioned doctoral theses and open access doctoral theses in French Open Science Monitor. And Vincent, I've read your work on the role of and contribution of doctoral theses to science. I just wondered what your views were on. Well, first of all, are doctoral theses counted in general monitoring and general measurement of open science? And also, what are your views on that, on the role of doctoral theses?
Yeah, very quickly, thank you for your comment and question. So of course, most theses right now are a series of articles. In most scientific fields, they're going to be a series of articles, but also theses are almost always online. Quite often, they're going to be online, disseminated by the university. So given those two aspects, I would assume, but that's a logical assumption, that they are more likely to be opened than closed. That being said, last week I was trying to find the thesis of one of the student I sat on his committee, and actually the thesis was under embargo for 2 years. Again, I thought that was really problematic. But I think the key thing with student, I was looking at your question in the chat, is about including open science training during their studies. And this is something we've been working on in Montreal as well as in other Canadian universities. I know it needs to be part of the general training of students, the same way that they have in their research methods class, probably a few hours on ethics, they need to have something on open science. And that's the way these practices will become mainstream in science.
Thank you.
Gemma, you're on mute.
Okay, that wasn't a good idea for me. Tony, any last words for Catherine on her question before we end today?
No, no, Vincent said it all.
Well, that was great. It wasn't over time. Thank you everyone for joining us. Can I also remind you that there is, even though today is the 4th and last of the Research on Research seminar series, there is another seminar next week, a CG seminar next week. Please look it up and register. Please also note that a recording of this session will be available on the CG website. Thank you, everybody, for a wonderful talk. Thank you to both of our presenters, Tony and Vincent. It's lovely to see you guys again and to interact, and we'll talk very soon. Bye, everyone. Thank you.